Hey everybody, welcome to Hope for Our Times. And man, this is so cool because I haven't had our guest on today in quite some time. I thought he forgot me, and then he says, hey, he's coming on. This is great, so cool. I'm blessed with wonderful guests and friends and colleagues. And today, joining me is Britt Gillette. Britt, this is great. Thank you for coming on. So cool.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
And I know you're taking away time from your family. You're super busy. You got all these different dynamics going on, but you are such a blessing. And so thank you. Please tell your family thank you when we're done too.
Sure will be. Thanks for having me.
Are you ready to just roll?
Sure, let's go.
Well, I tell you what, let me do this first. If people want to follow you, you're on Substack. You write all the time. How can people follow you? What's the best way?
Yeah, if they just go to brittgillette.substack.com, that's the central hub where all of my content is located. I'm still on YouTube and Rumble and other places, but if you go there to brittgillette.substack.com, you'll get daily notes, which is just things I think about, the news of the day, articles, videos, you'll get it all.
So I'm curious, how do you find time to write? Because you teach, you got a lot of family.
It's a lot of work, but I've got a wonderful wife, and together we somehow make it happen.
Yeah, and you have videos you do and so many other things. So, all right, let's just start. You wrote, not just recently, 6 potential triggers for the next global financial crisis, 6 of them. So we're going to walk through all 6. Number 1, and this is something I've been talking about for some time, and I don't know why people have been missing it. Some people have, like Gerald Celente and some others that are out there, been talking about for quite a while, but you've written about it, and now you're really zeroing in. People need to pay attention. Number 1, Chinese property market meltdown.
Sure. Yeah, so as you said, people have been talking about this for many years. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you could find all these videos of the Chinese ghost cities that were being built and nobody's living in them. Well, starting in 2021, we've seen really a collapse in property market prices in China. And this is very deflationary. We've seen Evergrande, which is one of the largest developers. Back in January, a court ordered them to liquidate. They have $300 billion in debt. What can't be paid back won't be paid back. So someone is owed that debt. And then in all likelihood, they also have creditors themselves that they may not be able to pay. And so this has a ripple effect. We have Country Garden, which at one time was the largest property developer in China by sales. And they're also in a Hong Kong court right now with a creditor trying to force them to liquidate. So this is very bad. When you have these defaults of this magnitude, what happens is you end up, that currency effectively goes away. So your currency supply shrinks. That's known as deflation. And you have this deflationary spiral where the currency is harder to find. It becomes hard for everyone to service their debts. And it becomes this deflationary spiral. That's what the world experienced during the Great Depression. And so as the second largest economy in the world, if China ends up in a deflationary spiral, it's hard to imagine that the rest of the world will be able to escape being drawn into that same deflationary vortex. And as you mentioned, these are 6 triggers we're going to talk about today of this coming financial crisis. I believe this crisis is coming, and it's most likely going to be the greatest financial crisis in the history of the world. And the only questions that remain are, what's the timeline in which it unfolds? And again, what will be seen as the trigger? There's many issues. I mean, this is really a house of cards, the whole global economy and the way it's set up. But just as we had with the great financial crisis, when people pointed to subprime loans as the ultimate catalyst that kicked that off, there's going to be some event that people point to here. We just don't know what that is yet.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the timeline. People want to know when, what's holding it together. I was going to ask you that next, but let's save that till we get through all 6 because I've been following the financial markets for a long, long time. And I grew up with that. You know, my dad, once he left the tech industry, I was just a little boy in the 1960s, he went into the financial industry. And so that's what I grew up with, was that. And it's been drilled into my head. So I followed these things. And I'm thinking, man, China's also got another problem because their population there is a terrible mess. The one-child policy, they know now this is a problem. They're finally admitting it. They started admitting that not too long ago. Can't have any girls. I mean, this whole, the failed policy of not following God's way in the book of Genesis. We see the Western world going that way also, but in China it's beneficial. So China's in a lot of trouble. All right, we'll move on from there unless you want to say something else about China.
We can move on.
Okay, the Japanese currency crises.
Right, so we also have an unfolding currency crisis in Japan. So recently the Japanese yen hit what's a over 30-year low relative to the US dollar, meaning they're experiencing inflation there for the first time in quite some time. And they actually risk having that turn into hyperinflation, just having it run away from them. And this is the result of decades of mismanagement by the Bank of Japan, where they've artificially suppressed interest rates. 5 years ago, a 10-year Japanese bond actually had a negative yield on it, which is really hard for me to wrap my mind around. Why would somebody say, I'll loan cash to the Japanese government for 10 years, and over the course of the next 10 years, they'll pay me back less than what I loaned them. And not only that, but the purchasing power of what I loan them will be less at the end. I mean, where do I sign, right? Well, nobody would make that agreement. What's been happening is the Bank of Japan has been going into the market, printing yen and buying that Japanese government debt, those bonds, in order to artificially suppress the interest rates. And the reason they're doing that is Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of 268%. It's the largest in the world. It's, believe it or not, twice as worse than the United States with all the issues that we have in the United States. And so if they raise rates, which they have to do to defend their currency, well, then that makes the interest on their debt increase substantially, and then they lose control of that debt, which means they lose control of the currency. So they're pretty much at a point where no matter what they do, it's going to lead to a crisis. And then, we talked about what are those catalysts that people talk about, similar to the great financial crisis and subprime loans. One thing that we may hear in the news in the future is the yen carry trade. And we can't get into the details of that right now, but basically what that is, it's been going on for well over a decade. These large hedge funds and financial institutions around the world, they'll borrow Japanese yen because of these artificially low interest rates, and then they'll use the proceeds to buy, say, dollar-denominated debt like a U.S. Treasury that yields 5%, and then they'll pocket the difference. And often they'll go out and they'll borrow massive amounts so that they can leverage that trade and make more than the 5%, make 10 or 20 or 40% or more. Once interest rates start rising, that yen carry trade no longer becomes the profitable endeavor that it is now. People start to that starts to unravel, which means there's going to be a sell-off in those non-yen denominated assets. So sell-offs in U.S. Treasuries, stocks around the world. It's going to most likely create an unraveling that is chaotic in nature, with margin calls, probably failures of some large institutions. So this could get bad at any moment. We don't know when this would happen, but eventually this is set to happen because this is an unavoidable crisis. Again, it's just a matter of what's the timing in which this unravels.
As I look at this, I think, people can become pretty fearful, but, we tie everything into the Bible. Can you help put it into a Bible frame for us, just as we're beginning this conversation?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is what we would expect to see with the way that the world has been run. God says we should have accurate weights and measures, and we have not had accurate weights and measures for a long time. We have fiat currencies that are backed by nothing. We have these financial shell games going on all around the world. But guys, whilst this could get really bad, who knows if we'll be here or not? But even if we are, if you know Jesus Christ, then there's nothing the world can throw at you that you can't get through. Jesus said there will be trials and sorrows in this world, but take heart, I've overcome the world. So if you are filled with fear, the way to respond to that is to turn to the Word of God and turn to Jesus. Fix your eyes on him, put your faith and trust in him. And that's the equivalent of building your house on solid rock rather than shifting sand.
Amen. Plus, we know biblically this whole house of cards, it is going to collapse anyway. So, you look at it, you go, all right, so we don't have, I mean, if we have the Bible perspective, we're going to be all right through this process, regardless of anything else. And our citizenship is in heaven. And praise God. But we got to be paying attention, because what you're talking about, this financial events, are signs, warning signs that the Bible gives us. These ominous signs that tell us, hey, be prepared, be smart. And I might ask you, what's the best way to be smart during this time? Maybe we'll get to that at the end too. What should we do? Number 3, so we've dealt with China and Japan. You have German deindustrialization. Let me read what you wrote here. Since reunification, Germany has been Western Europe's economic powerhouse, largely reliant on cheap Russian natural gas. However, after Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Germany struggled to secure affordable energy, leading to initial skyrocketing prices and ongoing energy insecurity. And then you talk about the instability and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about this German deindustrialization.
Yeah, so they really have an energy crisis in Germany, and it's a lot of it's tied to Russia and following the invasion of Ukraine, the cutoff of Russian natural gas being able to come over. But there's also other things. In the past, they've had nuclear power plants that supply abundant electricity, but their green initiatives that led to them shutting those down voluntarily makes no sense. But the heart of German economic power is this heavy industry. It's chemical industry, it's the manufacturing industry that requires this energy. And as this energy has gone, again, we don't have the peak prices we had 2 years ago in Europe. But if you're running a business, you really need certainty. You can't make a 5-year plan for your business if you don't know what the price of energy will be or if it will be available. So the logical conclusion many of these businesses are drawing is, well, we shouldn't be here. We should be in another country where those prices are more stable and the energy is more reliable. And so we're seeing that industry move away. One of the most recent examples is BASF, which is the largest chemical conglomerate in Europe. They're moving a lot of facilities over into China, investing billions of dollars, hiring employees in China, laying off workers in Germany. We saw, I think the most illustrative example occurred in the fall of 2022, when we had 4 German companies that were all over 125 years old. So these were companies founded in the 19th century, and they had continuous operations. They were in 4 different areas of the economy. They had survived World War I, Weimar Germany and the hyperinflation, where people are taking wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. They survived the rise of Nazi Germany, World War II, the bombing of Germany, everything since. All 4 of those companies went out of business on the same day in the fall of 2022, and it was directly traceable to the energy insecurity that we've seen following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is really leading to a deindustrialization of Germany. and that industry moving away. Well, Germany is the heart of the European Union economy. Germany was relied upon back, if you remember, back in 2011, they had a big debt crisis where some of the other nations in Europe, like Italy and Portugal, were seeing their interest rates skyrocket. And it was really Germany that was relied upon to be able to hold that whole thing together. Well, now if Germany starts falling apart, then we could see a currency crisis in Europe. We could see a reemergent debt crisis in Europe. All sorts of second order effects could come as a result of this. It's really a big mess. The whole global economy is.
So look at Germany, think how sure are you that it will happen with Germany? Or are you sure it will?
Well, it's happening. It's been happening. So we can see it happening. Right now, I believe the only top 10 economy in the world that isn't in a technical recession, meaning 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, is the United States. So Germany is in recession, Japan's in recession, China's in recession. So as these problems build upon one another, I believe it will become clear that we're in a depression, and we've likely been in one. It just hasn't really been acknowledged yet. Typically, those things get acknowledged after the fact. If we think back to the great financial crisis, they pinpointed the beginning of that to December 2007, but many people didn't even recognize it until late 2008, early 2009, certainly when you had Lehman Brothers collapse in September 2008. So that's almost a year going by before it was officially acknowledged in any way that we had that recession. So I could be wrong, but I think we're in one right now. Mm-hmm. I believe we're in a global depression, and that's going to become very clear in the very near future.
Again, we'll get to a time frame at the end of this. So we have this. We also have, there are people saying we're actually in World War III. We just don't admit that yet, too. I know you've even written about those things.
Yeah. I mean, and part of that is financial. So we don't see this kinetic war yet, meaning physical altercations directly between China, the United States, and Russia. But we've certainly seen an information war, a propaganda war, an ongoing financial war. Came out recently that China has dumped more U.S. treasuries recently than they ever have in the past. They're buying up massive amounts of gold. We've talked about the BRICS nations in the past. And so there really is this movement underway by the BRICS nations to decouple from the United States, to extricate themselves from the United States dollar-denominated financial system. And so they're actively working to undermine the U.S. dollar, and by default, U.S. military power as well. And part of that is what we've been seeing in the Red Sea, where this failure to be able to protect the shipping lanes by the United States in the Red Sea undermines U.S. military power, which undermines the power of the dollar. The two are inextricably linked. If you have a failed dollar, you can't project military power. If you can't project military power, the dollar and the treasury market fail. So the two are linked together in a way that they can't be separated.
Very fascinating, especially when we look China, Japan, Germany, failing. It's been well said. When everything is collapsing, you go to war. When you've lost all control and you look at where everything is, you got trouble at home, go to war. And
history tells us, unfortunately, yes.
Number 4, U.S. commercial real estate crash. Again, people like you are paying attention to it. Like I said, I watch a lot of financial things, so I've been watching this for some time. The empty buildings in China have been around for a long time, but we are seeing them, at least where I live, I see a lot of empty buildings. In the big cities, there's a lot of empty buildings. But we have brick and mortar problems. So explain a little bit more about this.
Sure. Well, a lot of these problems were already existent, but they've just been made worse by the pandemic and really work from home and hybrid work from home when people aren't coming into the office every day, then as a company, you're looking to cut expenses and you think, well, I don't need all of this office space. Maybe I need half the square footage I have now, or maybe I can eliminate it altogether and all those employees can work from home. And this is leading to larger vacancy rates in commercial real estate. And then that leads to lower cash flow for those properties, which means they can't necessarily support the debt that was taken on to buy those properties to begin with, usually 5, 6, 7 years ago, when those properties, those loans had much lower interest rates than what they will have now when they go to refinance. So most of these properties are on 5 to 7 year loans. It's not like a 30-year mortgage like you would have in a house here in the United States. And they're also 89% of commercial real estate loans are interest-only loans. And if you remember, during the financial crisis, we heard all about that. And so really they're just trying to take on whatever debt they could to get this cash flow. Well, the cash flow isn't there anymore. And now to refinance the property, it's going to be so expensive. They're being asked by banks to put up many millions of dollars more for buildings that in effect have lost significant value. Some of them, they've had instances of $200 to $400 million properties that now are $1, $2, $3 million is what the market value on those is. So these property developers, they simply walk away and the bank is left with the property. Now, this is a big problem for regional banks, which is going to be feeds into the next trigger we're going to talk about. But anywhere between, these are banks that have between probably 10 to $100 billion in assets. So we're not talking the big banks like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. We're not talking the super small community banks. But this is a big problem for those banks. And we've seen some of what that means last year with the banking crisis that we had. And as people start to learn of these portfolios and what they're doing to these banks, then again, that feeds into our next trigger.
Yeah. So number 5, the widespread bank failures.
Right. So we've got that commercial real estate problem that's hitting the regional banks, but we also have all of the banks have large bond portfolios and large mortgage portfolios. So these are based on the prevailing interest rates at the time. So 3-4 years ago, when interest rates were really low, they took their cash and they bought government bonds. Well, as interest rates go up, the prices of those bonds go down. So this has led to, in the United States alone, but this is a global problem. It's not just a U.S. problem, but in the United States alone, according to the FDIC, currently the banking system is sitting on about $600 billion in unrealized losses. Now, that means those are unrealized losses, right? They aren't real losses yet. But as we saw last March with Silicon Valley Bank, once depositors wake up to this idea and think, well, I'm not so sure if my bank is safe, I'm going to go ask for my cash. And they go ask for that cash. Well, the only way the bank can supply that is to sell these bonds that are underwater at a loss. And if there are enough depositors asking for their cash, eventually the bank becomes insolvent. It can't meet those demands. And that's when you have bank failures. And so we have not only a problem with government bonds, but also with mortgages in the same way. How many 2-3% mortgages are these banks sitting on? With inflation hitting so many people's pocketbooks, we're seeing a rise in defaults on credit cards, on auto loans, on any number of debt instruments that these banks are sitting on. And last year they came out, they helped bail this out. The Bank Term Funding Program was one of the programs that was set up at that time. That's now expired. So I would expect to see bank failures very soon. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if, today you check the headlines and there's bank failure. That's how close all of this is. I'm surprised that we haven't seen more already where they sit.
So as we look at bank failures, and I think of you mentioned 2 and 3% interest loans on your mortgage. Who is going to refinance right now if you have a 2.5% loan and you have, let's say, 10 or 15 years on it? Why would you go refinance something at 7%? So I imagine that's got to be a killer too.
Right. Yeah. Thousands of people have lost their jobs that dealt in refinancing because that's completely dried up. Like you said, who would do that? And most people, the only way they're taking on loans at these current rates is that they're forced to move for some reason. And even then, I'm getting questions from people who are saying, should I rent? Should I buy? And a lot of those people are choosing to rent because they look at the interest rates, they look at mortgages and where they sit right now. I mean, think about the great financial crisis. That was really predicated on this idea of a bubble in housing prices. The peak of that bubble in 2006, it took 6.8 times the median income to buy the median house. We're now at an all-time high that's approaching 8. So we're worse off today than we were back then. And we have higher interest rates today than we did back then. Trouble is brewing. We have a major bubble in the housing market again. We have bubbles in the stock market. We have bubbles in the bond market. So we talked about that bond market bubble has already burst. Peak of that was several years ago at those ultra low rates, but I know many people are thinking, well, they'll go down again. But you think about it, why would you, as we just talked about before with the Japanese government bonds, why would you willingly make this decision to lend your hard-earned cash to the Japanese government for 10 years at no interest? Why would you lend cash to the United States government and buy a 10-year treasury that yields less than 5%? When we all know inflation's higher than that, so your purchasing power gets eroded, and they're sitting on $34 trillion in debt, over $1 trillion in interest annually, more than we spend on defense. I think the market's going to demand a higher rate, and that may be a shock. That may end up being one of the triggers that sets this off, as when the next crisis comes and everyone expects, well, the Fed's going to cut rates and the rates will drop. What happens if they don't? What happens if instead they go up as people lose confidence in these fiat currencies? And so that's why I said we're looking at the greatest financial crisis in the history of the world.
Yeah, I'm convinced we are. We're going to get to number 6 in a minute, but I'm going to ask you, I want to go somewhere else first, and we still got to get to a timeline. I really just want to hear what you have to say. But as I look near where I live, there are so many homes that are being built, and they're big homes. I mean, really big homes. And I've been to various states throughout the country last 6 months, and it's the same thing there. Massive apartment complexes. Something doesn't make sense to me, Britt. If I watch the economy, I was in real estate before I was a pastor. I know how for people to make a mortgage payment as high as they are right now, it's unrealistic. I know how much money you have to make to be able to qualify, but yet this is happening and the building is still taking place. Granted, a lot of these massive apartment complexes are going to be they're going to be rentals, but I'll guarantee you the rental prices are going to be high. So as I look at this and I work it out, it makes no sense to me at all. There's something very fishy going on with this. I believe the only thing I can wrap my mind around with the leases or the rentals on apartments and so forth has something to do with the coming universal basic income. It's more, I mean, this might sound weird, but it's more of a big brother thing that is being planned. Because I can't, who's buying these houses? When I look at them, where I live, Britt, people are leaving California. They're not flocking to California. So why are they building them? And I mean, they are building thousands of them around us. Makes no sense.
Well, I think it's part of this bubble process. As we just mentioned, the bond bubble has burst, but the stock market bubble has not, and the real estate bubble has not. We're sitting at all-time highs of median income to home prices. A lot of cases, it's hedge funds going out and using borrowed money to buy up massive amounts of single-family homes. We saw this in the lead up to the Great Depression. Many people don't realize there was a massive real estate bubble in Florida in the 1920s. So this is the cycle that we follow with these central bank policies. They blow bubbles, the bubbles burst, they claim they're coming to the rescue, and they blow another bubble and that burst. I mean, that's the pattern we've seen in the last 25 years. We had the dot-com bubble, that burst, and then we had residential real estate bubble, and that burst. And now we have what many people are calling the everything bubble. We've seen the bond market bubble burst. We're going to see these other markets burst here because, as you said, how is this possible? Well, it's not. Right? It's not. And right now, if you remember the old Looney Tunes cartoon where the coyote would run over the cliff and he'd be suspended in midair, and he wouldn't fall until he looked down and realized that he wasn't standing on anything, and then he'd fall. Well, we're pretty much in that spot right there.
That's a great illustration.
And it's inevitable that the fall is going to happen. They can push these policies to try to kick the can down the road. Eventually, it reaches a point where they can't. And, in the middle of all of this, one of the triggers we could talk about is something like a war in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. We had a war in the Middle East that led to a spike in oil prices. Let's say oil prices doubled overnight. All of these bubbles would pop instantaneously the next day. The whole system would crash because we have a system that's made for just-in-time manufacturing and delivery, regular servicing of debt payments. And it's built on this idea that no big event's going to come along to disrupt that normal flow, that normal process. So if it does, and when it does, the system is not made to deal with that. We saw a glimpse of that 4 years ago with inventory in stores and supply chain issues and the snarling of those supply chains with the shutdowns that took place. But that's nothing compared to what would happen again if we saw a massive war in the Middle East, a spike in energy prices, or something like our number 6 trigger.
Number 6 trigger. I think of I think of Jenga as you're talking, just pulling out one piece at a time, then another. It is this whole house of cards is coming down. All the blocks are about ready to fall. Okay, the last thing we're going to get to is a timeline, but before we get to that, let's get to number 6. Sure. So we look at back to the very beginning, 6 potential triggers for the next global financial crisis. Number 1, Chinese property market meltdown. Number 2, Japanese currency crisis. Number 3, German deindustrialization. Number 4, U.S. commercial real estate crash. Number 5, widespread bank failures. Number 6, the rapture of the church.
Yes.
This is coming down, but we're going up.
Right. So again, just as war in the Middle East, a doubling of oil prices overnight would just shock the world system. Imagine what happens. The Bible tells us in the twinkling of an eye, the rapture will occur. Imagine potentially hundreds of millions of people simply disappearing. People who are important workers, important to society in general, but from an economic standpoint, people that are the linchpin of their communities, helping drive that supply chain, helping consume, helping to live. Imagine all of these empty houses with no people around to pay the mortgage or to pay the taxes anymore, or to pay the HOA fees. As we saw back in the great financial crisis in Florida, there were communities where many people don't realize that HOA fee is just simply divided by the number of homeowners. Well, if half the community disappears, the fee doubles. And then that caused many people to have to default on their home. So this has so many different second order effects. If you had, that would be a shock to the system that would collapse everything. The rapture of the church, I have no doubt about it. You mentioned earlier the timing and why hasn't all this fallen apart yet? Very well could be that God's waiting for the rapture of the church and that it will all somehow stay glued together until that moment. And then suddenly everything falls apart.
Yeah, I can't help but think in Revelation chapter 5, where Jesus is the only one who's worthy to loose the seals on the scroll. I believe the seal or the scroll is the title deed to the earth. And when you look at it, what happens in the Garden of Eden, Adam forfeits that, but Jesus is the second Adam. He has come to redeem, and he does redeem. When I was in real estate, it was, many years ago, I was in title insurance. So I was dealing with the attorneys and all the legal stuff behind the scenes. And the one thing, as you know, Britt, in title, you have to make sure whoever is purchasing the title, you're going to be a buyer, you're buying property. In this case, we think of earth transferring title to Jesus. Well, when a buyer is getting the property, I had to make sure every single judgment was satisfied against the person who owned the property before I took ownership. And I look at that with the tribulation. When the seals are loosed on the scroll, these are the things, the judgments are going to be satisfied because Jesus is taking what's his. And that is what's going on, but in a very spiritual dynamic. But I just find it very fascinating as we look at it. So when we think of the rapture, no, everything's being held together until Jesus says, okay, the worthy one unloosens the scroll, and here it goes. And it is going to happen. I look in also from my perspective, the financial crisis that's coming is so massive that I don't see how it can't be anything but what the Bible describes as coming in the future, because it keeps building and building and building. Granted, we could have a small one, and Jesus can't keep the lid on. He will keep the lid on until he says now. But man, everything is building there. You have in here, when the crisis takes hold, you can be sure the solution offered by politicians and central bankers throughout the world will involve granting more power and control to centralized government authorities. They made no attempt to conceal their desire to roll out central bank digital currencies, and the next crisis will give them the opportunity to seek to offer CBDCs as the solution. Man, all of this is going to this biblical direction. So we see the warning signs, they're ominous, but Britt, we don't need to be afraid at all, do we?
No, not at all. You know, as I believe as I end that, I say, you know, this crisis is coming, but something else is coming, the rapture of the church and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Jesus has already won the victory. We have, as you said, nothing to fear, nothing to be afraid of, no matter what we endure here in this world. Again, we'll go through trials and sorrows here in this world, but if you have Jesus, that nothing this world throws at us, it should bother us at all. We've got everything if we have Jesus.
Amen. Britt, it's been great having you on here with me today. Any final thoughts before you go? And by the way, I want to make sure again, everybody, I want to make sure you connect with Britt if you haven't already. He also has 2 of his books behind him. I see you have Pablo's hat behind you too. I see it back there. That's very cool. Pablo Frassini's hat. You have 2 of your books up, back there. You can go to Britt Gillette to his website and get those books. Go to Pablo's and get the hat. But sure. Britt, again, how can people connect with you?
Well, again, if you just go to brittgillette.substack.com, that's really the central location where I'm at now. It has all the videos, all the articles, any of my thoughts are there. People can reach me directly there. So that's the place to go, is brittgillette.substack.com.
Fantastic. Britt, it's been great with you today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And make sure you go to Britt Gillette. Check out everything that he has. I know you're going to be blessed. I know many of you already have. God bless you, everybody. See you soon.